Jeffrey Dahmer, the description of which some viewers may find disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
There is no question in my mind that what Jeffrey Dahmer became was the embodiment of evil.
First thing that we saw was a human head that was in a refrigerator.
The bodies had totally disappeared, not a trace. None of them knew what had happened to their sons.
And no one in a million years could have guessed the monstrosity that was inside his head.
When the city of Milwaukee awoke on the morning of July 23, 1991, the damage had already been done. Best known for its many breweries, Milwaukee had overnight become notorious as the home of one of the worst serial killers in history. The night before, in a small one-bedroom apartment on the city's west side, police had discovered a death chamber. Only one man ever escaped that apartment to tell the story. 6 months later, in the Milwaukee County Courthouse, 32-year-old Tracy Edwards would recount a night of sheer terror at the hands of Jeffrey Dahmer. Late in the afternoon of July 22nd, Dahmer approached Edwards, who was eating with some friends at the Grand Avenue Mall.
And he said he was a professional photographer. He usually pays people for pictures and stuff like that if anybody was interested in making money at that time.
He offered Edwards $100 to pose nude at Dahmer's apartment. According to Edwards, there was no indication of any homosexual intent.
He didn't even act like it at that time.
At first, Edwards hesitated, but needed the money and agreed to go to Dahmer's apartment to check things out. They entered the Oxford apartment complex, and Dahmer unlocked the door to apartment 213.
When we got inside, he turned off burglar alarms. I asked him why. First, it was a foul odor, okay?
Tell us about that. What kind of an odor?
It was just like an odor. I didn't quite know what it was. You know, he told me a sewer pipe had broke and management would take care of it.
There were security cameras and a sophisticated alarm system.
He said the part of the neighborhood he was in, he was protecting his property, things like that. It was like normal, pretty decent apartment, had nice things in it.
They sat down on the couch. Tracy Edwards suspected nothing. He was simply visiting with a normal, everyday person, a good conversationalist.
He asked me, was I interested in doing the photography? You know, I told him I was still contemplating, so therefore he offered me a beer and a rum and coke mixture.
Dahmer drank a beer too, as Edwards sipped at his rum and coke.
I'm not a big liquor drinker, so it didn't taste that good to me.
While he didn't know it then, his distaste for liquor may have saved Tracy Edwards' life. The drink was drugged, Dahmer's modus operandi for gaining control over his victims. To Edwards, the mood seemed to grow heavy. He decided to skip the photos and prepared to leave.
Yeah, then I was just, I don't know, getting a little agitated maybe, you know, because of the smell and things. And then he threw my conversation off talking about the fish in the fish tank, you know.
As Edwards turned to look at the fish, Dahmer seized the moment. He slapped a handcuff on Edwards' left wrist and placed a large knife against his ribs.
I think, like, you know, what's going on, you know? This guy is so nice, and all of a sudden, you know, it's like he's pulling knives and handcuffs and all on me, you know. He told me at that point if I wouldn't do what he said, he would kill me. It's like not the same person that we met at Grand Avenue Mall.
How is he different?
His face structure seemed different. You know, his body structure is like it wasn't him anymore, you know. It's like it was a totally different guy there.
Dahmer then seemed to calm down. He told Edwards the key to the handcuffs was in the bedroom, and with the knife at Edwards' back, guided him there. As they entered the bedroom, Edwards noticed a large blue drum against the wall, but didn't ask about it. With Edwards still cuffed on his left wrist only, they sat on the bed together and began to watch a tape of The Exorcist III, which Dahmer said was his favorite movie. Periodically, while watching the tape, Dahmer would rock back and forth, mumbling and chanting.
And then he would turn around and try to ask me to put both of my hands behind my back, and I wouldn't, do it. I would talk to him. I'd tell him, you can trust me. You don't have to do this, and that would calm him down a little bit.
After a while, Dahmer assumed control again.
He told me to lay down, face down, put both of my hands behind my back, because he changed again at that point, like he got more aggressive at that time. He kind of laid across me, put his head across my chest like he was listening to my heart, because at a point he told me he was going to eat my heart at that point.
Said he was going to eat your heart?
Yes, that's correct.
Did he still have the knife?
Yeah.
Where was the knife pointed?
When I was on the floor, he had it pointed at my groin area at that time. I knew something was about to happen, so I suggested that I go to the bathroom. I had to use the bathroom.
Dahmer let him go. Edwards said he seemed calmer when he returned.
Yeah, I told him I want to sit in the front because it's an air conditioner. I was just going to try to jump out the window or go for the door. So I had to unbutton my shirt to try to make him feel more at ease. And then I just sat on the couch and he just started going out of himself again.
Going out of himself?
Yeah, he was paying me no attention at that time.
Edwards seized the opportunity. He hit Dahmer and bolted out the door. As he ran down the street, he flagged a passing police car. The police, with Edwards, returned to the apartment and found Dahmer and his chamber of horrors. There were photos strewn about of young men in various stages of dismemberment. Realizing the enormity of the crime scene, police arrested Dahmer, sealed the apartment, and called in County Medical Examiner Dr. Jeffrey Jensen.
First thing that we saw was a human head that was in a refrigerator, and after that it was we considered to be a localized disaster.
Jensen then led a room-by-room search, finding body parts, skulls, and a human heart in the freezer. They found soup kettles filled with skulls, male genitals, and human hands. There was a complete skeleton in the bedroom, and the blue tub contained 3 human torsos.
In the freezer component, there was another frozen skeleton, and that was also inventoried. And then it was the process of piecing together, so to speak, the different body parts with skulls.
The morning after his arrest, the startling images of Jeffrey Dahmer's freezer and other evidence being hauled out of his apartment beamed all over the world. In Milwaukee, the discovery of a serial killer terrified families who had loved ones missing.
Less than 5 minutes.
Stanley Miller's nephew, Ernest, had disappeared 10 months earlier.
That morning when I woke up and saw it on the news, something just drew me there. I just knew he was there.
He was right. Ernest Miller's skull was among those discovered in the apartment. It was Oliver Lacey's head in the refrigerator, the head of Emmanuel Lacey's father and Catherine Lacey's son.
I even went over there and I seen them take him out and all his things, and I walked around the building and I got a cold feeling in my stomach. It's like a pain had hit me in my stomach.
The pain would turn to horror as they learned exactly how their loved ones died. Necrophilia, dismemberment, cannibalism, lobotomies. Within hours of his arrest, Jeffrey Dahmer admitted to all this and more.
He wanted to confess. It was clearly voluntary. He wanted to get it off. He helped the police solve murders that they didn't even know about, that they were murders. So he wanted to unload.
His full confession would detail 11 murders within his tiny apartment, 4 more in the basement of his grandmother's house, 1 in a hotel room, and another, his first, in 1979 in his boyhood home in Bath, Ohio. His upbringing, as he traced it now for police, was in some ways unusual for a serial killer.
He was not sexually abused, and he was not physically abused by his parents. A third feature, less frequently found, but often found in serial killers, is economic deprivation. In other words, raised in financial hardships. Quite the opposite was the case in Dahmer's situation. He was raised in an affluent home. Indeed, they lived on 1 1/4 wooded acres with a private pond. Dahmer's father is an educated man with a doctor's degree in chemistry. In my opinion, Dahmer himself has a superior intellect.
But in another respect, he did fit the profile of a serial killer. He was a loner who had difficulty relating to people. Author and retired FBI agent Robert Ressler coined the term serial killer during his time as head of the FBI unit that tracks such criminals. He has studied the childhood behavior of many serial killers and found that most don't interact well, rarely dating as teenagers. In their isolation, they begin to have powerful fantasies.
The fantasies become violent, retribution, getting even with those who have been unfair with me, hurting others, destroying property, vandalism, setting fires. All these things kind of become interwoven with sexual fantasies. And the sexual fantasies, which again are normal for a young pre-adolescent or adolescent, become abnormal in that they become violent, they become hostile.
As children, many serial killers abuse animals. In his confession, Jeffrey Dahmer talked at length about his adolescent fascination with dissection, even picking up roadkills to examine the anatomy. A boyhood neighbor stumbled across this dog's head, mounted in Dahmer's backyard. Around the same time he was mutilating animals, Dahmer had his first homosexual experience with a friend who lived nearby. But as he discovered his homosexuality, his fantasies became deviant.
It had nothing to do with him being gay. If he had been heterosexual, his victims would have been women.
At the trial, court-appointed psychiatrist George Palermo recounted one of Dahmer's teenage fantasies about a male jogger.
I liked him, and I had the idea of hitting him on the head and having sex with him. Those are the words that he stated.
He in fact tried to do that, but the man didn't jog by that day, and so it didn't come to pass. This was quite early.
Forensic psychiatrist Park Dietz spent many hours interviewing Dahmer. He feels that Dahmer somehow began to associate sexual arousal with the mutilation of animals and thoughts of harming and controlling people.
My best guess of how that happened is that he was at the age at which all boys are having sexual arousal in response to diverse stimuli. Boys of that age get stimulated while they're riding to school on the bus or on a roller coaster. And in the course of that, they can, without trying to, without knowing it, become conditioned to quite coincidental stimuli. And I think that's what happened to Dahmer, that somehow he became conditioned accidentally to thoughts of violence and control and mutilation.
Dahmer's sexual attractions and his ability to control them would become the central question in his 1992 sanity trial. In high school, Dahmer was regarded as something of an oddball. Often ridiculed, he resorted to playing the clown to get attention. Classmates began referring to any prank as doing a Dahmer. Perhaps his most creative effort was on a class trip to Washington, D.C. Classmates recall that on a dare, he talked his way into a personal tour of the Vice President's White House office, a spot not normally open to visitors. He attended his senior prom in May 1978 with 16-year-old Bridget Geiger. A nervous Jeffrey, afraid he would stick Bridget with the pin, had Geiger's mother put on the corsage. Just weeks after the prom, Dahmer would kill his first victim. There is no single key that unlocks the mystery of Jeffrey Dahmer, but one clue lies in the relationship of his parents, which was troubled at best. When Jeffrey was 18, they divorced. His mother Joyce left for Wisconsin. and Father Lionel, with younger brother David, stayed at a nearby motel. In the confusion of the separation, Jeffrey was left alone for several weeks in the house on West Bath Road. When he picked up hitchhiker Stephen Hicks, Dahmer didn't know he would kill him. They came back to Dahmer's empty home and had a couple of beers. But when Hicks decided it was time to get going, Dahmer was in no mood to be alone. The guy wanted to leave, Dahmer recalled. I didn't want him to leave. He picked up a barbell and hit Hicks over the head, and then strangled him. Jeffrey Dahmer had acted out his fantasy, and now the grim reality of a dead body was staring him in the face. He took the corpse into a crawl space beneath the house and cut it up, placing portions of it in plastic garbage bags. He loaded Hicks' body in his car and headed for the local dump. On the way, a policeman stopped him for swerving over the center line and administered a sobriety test, which Dahmer passed. Dahmer was just about to leave when the officer noticed the garbage bags in the back seat. Smoothly, Dahmer explained that it was garbage from his parents' house. The unsuspecting officer sent him on his way. Dahmer had told the most important lie of his young life and gotten away with it. A frightened Jeffrey Dahmer took the body back home and into the crawl space. There, with a sledgehammer, he broke the bones into tiny bits. He took the fragments to a hillside on his property and, spinning slowly in a full circle, scattered the bones all over the land. Stephen Hicks had totally disappeared.
The first slaying occurred in 1978. The parents had no idea what happened to their son. No trace of the body was found until Dahmer confessed in 1991. That was 13 years of living hell.
Jeffrey Dahmer was repulsed by what he had done. Already a heavy drinker in high school, he continued to seek refuge in alcohol. He entered Ohio State University in the fall of 1978, but drank himself out of school after one semester. His father was concerned and talked Jeffrey into joining the Army. He did so, and trained to be a medic, spending untold hours studying human anatomy. He was shipped to Germany, but was discharged 2 years later at the age of 20, again because his drinking was so compulsive. Feeling lost, he came to Milwaukee to live with his grandmother in this house, tucked into the safe, tidy suburb of West Allis. Although arrested in 1982 for exposing himself to 2 adolescent boys, the 22-year-old Dahmer tried, in his own words, to walk the straight and narrow. For a while, he attended church with his grandmother and stopped drinking. In his confession, he stated that he tried at this time to suppress any homosexual thoughts. He got work in a blood plasma center and later as a mixer, making candies for Ambrosia chocolate. But eventually, he slipped back into drinking. He began going out to gay bars and sometimes not coming home. In November 1987, in the 219 Club, Jeffrey Dahmer met Steve Toomey. The two left together and got a room at the Ambassador Hotel. According to Dahmer, they drank heavily and engaged in consensual sex. Dahmer passed out, and when he awoke, Toomey was lying in bed next to him, dead. Dahmer was confused. He bought a large suitcase and put Toomey's body inside it. He then walked out the front door of the hotel and hailed a cab. He had the driver help him with his heavy baggage and headed for his grandmother's house. With his grandmother gone to church, he took the body to the basement and dismembered it. When he was finished, he threw it all out in the trash. It had been 9 years since Stephen Hicks, and now Dahmer had killed again. This time, he would no longer resist his violent fantasies. 2 months later, Dahmer was back at the 219 Club. Outside, he met a 14-year-old Native American boy, James Dockstader. He asked James if he wanted to come to West Allis with him and make some money posing naked for pictures. Dockstader agreed and became victim number 3. Dahmer was perfecting the process. Once back at his grandmother's house, Dahmer slipped a drug into a drink, and when Dockstader passed out, Dahmer had oral sex with him, strangled, dismembered, and then disposed of him. 2 months after killing Dockstader, Dahmer repeated the ritual with Richard Guerrero. In September 1988, the 28-year-old Dahmer left his grandmother's house and rented a cheap apartment in a rough section of town. The day after he moved in, he went cruising for men, and not far from his new apartment came across a 13-year-old Laotian named Suntom Synthesymphone. He enticed the boy to his apartment to take pictures. While waiting for the sleeping potion to kick in, Dahmer began to fondle the boy. The boy panicked and ran out of the apartment to his nearby home. When Suntom's parents heard their son's story, they called the police, who arrested Dahmer. On January 30th, 1989, Jeffrey Dahmer was convicted of second-degree sexual assault. He was released on bond until sentencing in May. In the interim, he would kill again. This time, the victim was 24-year-old Anthony Sears. At the May sentencing, the 5-time killer spoke to the judge and pleaded for leniency on his sexual assault charge. This enticing a child was the climax of my idiocy. If anything would shock me out of my past behavior patterns, it is this. The judge felt that there was still hope of saving the sex offender and sentenced Dahmer to a year in a work-release prison with orders that he receive treatment for his drinking and sexual problems. But in a bureaucratic mix-up, as Dahmer approached his release date a year later, he still had not received counseling for alcoholism. In March 1990, Dahmer's father Lionel wrote a letter to the judge for the case asking him not to release his son before he had completed a treatment program. I sincerely hope that you might intervene in some way to help my son, who I love very much and for whom I want a better life. This may be our last chance to institute something lasting. One day after Lionel Dahmer mailed that letter, his son Jeffrey walked out of prison. On May 13th, he signed a lease for apartment 213 in the Oxford Apartments. 2 weeks later, he would kill again. Most serial killers are sexual deviants. Usually they are either sadists, like Ted Bundy, or they are necrophiles, like Jeffrey Dahmer. Sadists enjoy the power of taking a human life, but Jeffrey Dahmer hated killing.
He had to get himself intoxicated every time he killed one of his victims, and he had to get himself intoxicated again in order to dismember them, because he found those aspects distasteful.
But it was a means to an end in obtaining a sexual partner. Ernest Miller met Jeffrey Dahmer on a street corner near the Oxford Apartments. Miller was an accomplished dancer. Dahmer later told police he immediately took a liking to the muscular 24-year-old and offered him money to pose for pictures. Miller agreed, and once in the apartment, Dahmer drugged him. But Miller woke up sooner than expected, and Dahmer, instead of strangling him, was forced to slit his throat. Dahmer had sex with the dead body, and while he was still naked, dismembered it. Dahmer later stated he always dismembered his victims while in the nude.
What he wanted was something that he could hug, spend his time next to, fondle, and not have any demands made for sodomy, which he did not like. The dilemma he had was that he didn't have the social skills to find someone who would find that gratifying and wanted no more.
Dahmer began to keep souvenirs. He took Polaroids as Miller bled to death on the bed. Dahmer then decapitated him, boiled the flesh off the head, painted the skull, and kept it. It's common among serial killers to keep jewelry, photos, even body parts of victims as a keepsake. Dahmer took it one horrifying step further with Ernest Miller.
He related this was a person he really liked. He indicated that he had filleted his heart and kept it in the freezer, and he also kept his bicep. He stated that it tasted like beef or a filet mignon. He ate only the people that he really liked, and he wanted them to be a part of him or with him all the time.
Sometimes I just think, well, maybe this is just a bad dream. You know, I'm going to wake up tomorrow and all this whole thing has been a bad dream, because there's no one in this world like that.
In fact, Dahmer may have represented a new wave of serial killer.
Initially, the serial killers were like Ted Bundy, the predator serial killer, picking up a victim in a bar, sexually assaulting and disposing of the bodies. Sometimes, as in the case of the hillside stranglers, dumping up the side of the road. We are now finding these individuals spending more time with their victims and having a desire to keep that relationship going for a period of time. This hit and run type is becoming less frequent, and the collector, as I call them, is becoming more frequent.
Dahmer was attracted to men with dark skin and thin, athletic builds. He was also a necrophile, but he wasn't necessarily drawn to corpses. He wanted a completely compliant partner.
He tried various strategies to solve that need of his. He drugged men so that they would be available to him all night long. He stole a mannequin from a department store so that he could lie next to that and fondle it.
And Dahmer even had a fantasy that he tried to pursue actively, and that was to create a sex zombie by drilling holes in the heads of his victim with a drill and injecting acid into the brains of his victims in just a limited amount. The fantasy was to kill the brain, to kill the willpower.
It was classic serial killer thinking, making the human into an object. In late May, Dahmer killed Tony Hughes, a deaf mute whom he had known for some time. Dahmer told police that, as with his other victims, Hughes came to his apartment to make money posing for pictures. In nearly all the murders, police had only Dahmer's confession to go on. While much of it was later confirmed as true, Tony Hughes' mother feels Dahmer not only killed her son, he lied about him afterward.
He knew my son, and my son trusted him as a friend. And he didn't have to go to his house for money. Because today, the last day I saw him, he had cashed his check. He had over $400 in his pocket. So he didn't need his $50. And he wasn't a prostitute out on the street either, like the media portrayed all of them. I'm speaking for Tony. I can't speak for anybody else. I know about my son.
2 days after killing Tony Hughes, Dahmer went to the Grand Avenue Mall. He testified he met an Asian boy and struck up a conversation with him. As had worked so often before, Dahmer said he offered him $50 to come to his apartment to take pictures. The boy agreed. Although Dahmer stated he did not know it at the time, the boy was Conorak Synthesubphone, the brother of the boy Dahmer had been arrested for fondling in 1988. After Conorak passed out from the drug drink, Dahmer had oral sex with the boy and then went out to get more beer. The boy woke up while Jeffrey was gone. He was naked and disoriented from the drugs. He stumbled out of the apartment and into the street. Neighbors tried to help the boy and saw bruises on his body. One of them made this 911 call.
Okay, hi, I'm on 25th and State, and this is young man. He is butt naked. He has been beaten up. He's very bruised up. He can't stand. He's study fall out. He is butt naked. He has no clothes on. He was really hurt. And I ain't got no corner on him. I just seen him, and he needs some help.
Where is he at?
On 25th and State, the corner of 25th and State.
A police squad car and an ambulance were immediately dispatched. Jeffrey Dahmer was returning from a neighborhood bar when he saw the crowd on the corner of 25th and State. As he had done many times before, Dahmer coolly walked up to the authorities and lied. He told the police he and Conorak were lovers who had had a fight. He laughed and said Conorak had acted this way before when he had had too much to drink. The officers went back to the apartment where Dahmer showed them some pictures of Conorak and himself. Police later reported that Konarak tried to speak in a slurred Asian dialect, but was unintelligible. The officers noticed an odd smell in the apartment, but did not investigate. If they had gone into the bedroom, they would have stumbled across Tony Hughes' decomposing body. Had they run Jeffrey Dahmer's name through police computers, it would have told them he was still on probation for a sex crime. In the end, the officers took Dahmer at his word that the 14-year-old boy was an adult. They left Konarak with Dahmer in the living room. Back at the squad car, they chuckled about the unique domestic disturbance.
The intoxicated Asian naked male was returned to his sober boyfriend, and we're at 8.
Dahmer later confessed that moments after the officers left, he strangled Konarak and had sex with the body. He took pictures as he dismembered the corpse and then put the torso in the big blue vat. Dahmer kept the skull.
Basic law enforcement practices were not followed.
When the story of the incident broke after Dahmer's arrest, Police Chief Philip Areola suspended the 3 officers. The incident ignited the gay and minority communities into weeks of rallies, vigils, and protests over police insensitivity.
It's nice that you suspended the people, but we don't want anybody suspended. We want to be treated with dignity.
Milwaukee's mayor would call it the most traumatic time in the city's history. Not long after he killed Konarak Synthesyphone, Dahmer lost his job at the chocolate factory. He was broke, behind on his rent, and spending all his money on cruising and buying materials for disposing of the bodies. The one momentary pleasure for him was sex, which inevitably led to murder. Dahmer would kill 4 more young men before Tracy Edwards was lucky enough to escape on July 22nd, 1991. The trial of Jeffrey Dahmer opened on January 30th, 1992, 6 months after his arrest. A bulletproof shield divided the spectators from the participants. It was an audience filled largely with victims' families, as well as Dahmer's father and stepmother. Jeffrey Dahmer did not testify at the trial. He had already pleaded guilty to the killings. The only question was his sanity at the time of the murders. If found insane, Dahmer would be housed in a mental institution. The burden of proving he was not sane fell to the defense.
I think everybody's initial reaction is, you have to be nuts to do something like this. And that is the first reaction of everybody. That's one thing to say that. It's another thing to prove it. And in order to prove it, you must show psychosis.
Psychosis is that particular mental malady where the person can't understand reality. When they think a stick is a bat, or they fear that a human being is a devil, that type of unreality, one of the more famous ones, the Son of Sam case, where the man was taking orders from a dog.
At least he said he was. Serial killer David Berkowitz, known as the Son of Sam, murdered 6 young women in New York in the mid-1970s. When he was apprehended, Berkowitz said he was insane. It was not convincing to the judge, who found him competent to stand trial. He was sentenced to life in prison. In the Dahmer trial, the jury first had to determine if the killer had a mental disease, and if he did, was he able to understand that his actions were wrong? And further, was he able to act in accordance with the law? Dahmer's defense was that his mental illness was necrophilia, and that his sexual urges toward dead bodies became so strong that he couldn't stop himself from killing. As the prosecution saw it, Dahmer was not crazy, but slowly accepted the idea of killing.
Certainly as Jeffrey Dahmer first thought of the idea of having sex with an unconscious man and then a dead man, certainly it shocked him, but he kept turning over the fantasy in his mind. Finally it became tolerable, and then he decided to act out on the fantasy, to realize it.
And when he did kill, McCann argued, he was sane and even methodical. Dahmer would most often cruise for victims on Friday, so he would have the weekend to enjoy and dispose of the bodies. If he didn't meet someone on Friday, he wouldn't kill that week. Dahmer never attacked on the street, only in the controlled environment of his apartment. He never picked up anyone with a car, because he figured abandoned cars and missing persons would provide clues for police.
So he was a man that demonstrated consistently that when he wished to do it, he could control himself. Police asked him, Mr. Dahmer, do you know what you're doing was wrong? He said, well, absolutely. That's why I put double locks on the doors. That's why I had television cameras, as though that anyone broke in, that they would see, they'd leave before they discovered the bodies.
It was never a question of whether or not he understood the wrongfulness of his conduct. He knew what he was doing was wrong. The question was, was he able to stop it? I think as he progressed into this killing spree that he certainly got crazier and crazier. So basically I tried to argue that he was crazy certainly after about the 9th or 10th murder.
It was about that time, in the spring of 1991, that Dahmer began to experiment with the idea of creating a decorative altar of skulls. He never built the altar, but later sketched it for police. And it was also around the time he tried to give his victims crude lobotomies to create sex zombies who would never leave him.
To me, that is not a sane fantasy. That is not something coming from a person who has their psychological act together. It's coming from a person that has lost and really have stripped their gears of sanity and are now wallowing in some sort of a psychotic haze.
Psychiatrist Park Dietz testified for the prosecution. He feels that Dahmer was not the runaway train Jerry Boyle described, but as with most serial killers, one with Dahmer at the controls.
Nothing drives any of these men from fantasy to action, except themselves. They're in the driver's seat.
In his closing argument, Prosecutor McCann played on the issue of Dahmer's characteristic lying. McCann warned the jury not to be fooled.
He fooled the police in Bath, Ohio. He fooled the police when he had Hicks' body in his car. He fooled the Milwaukee police on the counteract Simpson Dawn case. Ladies and gentlemen, he's fooled a lot of people, including the court that gave him a year's probation. Please, please, don't let this murderous killer fool you.
Jerry Boyle, however, offered a synopsis of Dahmer's life that portrayed a sick, out-of-control man.
Jeffrey Dahmer, as a total human being, a person who's into fantasy, drugging, keeping skulls in locker, cannibalism, having delusions, chanting and rocking, picking up roadkill, going and trying to get a mannequin home so he can play sex with a mannequin, posing people who are dead that he killed for pictures, masturbating all over the place. This is Jeffrey Dahmer.
Family members of victims tried to pass the time as the jury deliberated. It took less than a day to return a verdict.
In regard to the death of Ernest Miller, did the defendant Jeffrey L. Dahmer have a mental disease? Answer, no.
For every murder with which he was charged, Dahmer was found sane. At a press conference later, District Attorney McCann told reporters how happy he was that uncontrollable sexual urges had not been accepted as grounds for insanity.
We were all concerned of this emerging as a defense, not just in a murder case, but more likely in rape cases and child molesting cases.
At the sentencing hearing 2 days later, Judge Lawrence Graham allowed victims' families to tell both the court and Dahmer about the impact the crimes had made. It was one of the most emotional moments of the trial.
You took my 17-year-old son away from me. I'll never get a chance to tell him that I loved him. I'd have a chance to tell him that I love him the last time I saw him, which will be a year tomorrow.
Never, Jeffrey! Jeffrey! I hate you, mother! I hate you! That is out of control! Don't me, Jeffrey! I'll kill you, goddamn it!
order was restored, Dahmer, who never testified, addressed the court.
I know how much harm I have caused. I tried to do the best I could after the arrest to make amends, but no matter what I did, I could not undo the terrible harm I have caused. My attempt to help identify the remains was the best that I could do, and that was hardly anything. I know the families of the victims will never be able to forgive me for what I have done. I have seen their tears, and if I could give my life right now to bring their loved ones back, I would do it. I am so very sorry.
Judge Graham then read the sentence.
Count 1, the court will impose the mandatory life sentence.
Dahmer received the maximum penalty for each and every count. But his story was far from finished. In fact, it began to take on a life of its own. Jeffrey Dahmer was one of the most publicized serial killers in history. But the fascination with such murders began more than a century ago. In London, between September and November of 1888, someone murdered and mutilated 5 prostitutes. The killer wrote letters to the police and the London Times, taunting them with clues of his next murder. He signed the letters Jack the Ripper. The lasting appeal of the Ripper legend is that he stopped after 5 killings and was never caught. Jack the Ripper became a model for how the media portrays serial killers. Modern-day killers like Albert DeSalvo, the Boston Strangler, and Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, gained catchy nicknames in the press. Son of Sam, David Berkowitz, also wrote letters to the newspapers. Our dark fascination with serial murders has spilled into our entertainment, spawning some of the most popular movies ever made. Inevitably, as the Jeffrey Dahmer case grabbed worldwide attention, those with an eye to profit took the marketing of killers one step further. Serial killer trading cards, T-shirts, even a comic book exploited and glamorized the crimes.
I don't think my book will bother him as much as the fact that Dahmer was in the top 25 most intriguing people of 1991 for People magazine.
Serial killers are mostly intrigued by themselves. In fact, they are so self-centered that one source of ego fulfillment can be the body count. In August 1991, when Jeffrey Dahmer's case was one of the top stories in the country, police in Mississippi arrested Donald Leroy Evans for killing a 6-year-old girl. Soon, Evans confessed to nearly 60 killings across the country, causing just the kind of speculation a serial killer enjoys.
It involves enough bodies to make people forget almost what happened in Milwaukee.
But to date, very few of the murders Evans confessed to have been verified. With homicide rates soaring nationally in the last 30 years, serial killers may be losing some of their shock value. When William Herons killed 3 people in Chicago in 1945, it was called the crime of the century.
Herons only killed 3 people. And when I say only killed 3 people, by today's standard, you don't even get attention of the media unless you've knocked off about 12 or 15 people.
In fact, it's all too easy to watch the stories about serial killers unfold in our newspapers and on our TV screens. It's a safe titillation of the height of evil, as long as we keep a distance. The alternative is not to hear about the killings at all, as was the case in the old Soviet Union. Under communist rule, the press was strictly censored in reporting violent crime. As a result, Russians never knew that serial killers like Andrei Chikatilo were on the prowl. The self-proclaimed mad beast murdered 53 people in a 10-year spree. With the end of censorship, his 1992 trial received wide press coverage and left viewers in disbelief and shock. Milwaukee is a city still healing from the crimes of Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer's apartment building was torn down about a year after the trial, erasing a painful landmark of his crimes. Then, on November 28, 1994, at the state prison in Portage, Wisconsin, Dahmer was sent on a bathroom cleaning detail with 2 other prisoners. When guards left the 3 unattended, one of the inmates, Chris Scarver, who called himself Christ, attacked both his fellow prisoners with a metal bar from a weight set. 2 hours later, Jeffrey Dahmer was pronounced dead at Divine Savior Hospital. The horror that one man brought upon an entire city is still difficult to comprehend.
There is no question in my mind that what Jeffrey Dahmer became was the embodiment of evil. I think that if we had lived in the Middle Ages, that would have been the defense. And a jury might have believed that, in fact, the devil took over his being and caused him to do these things.
Dahmer, of course, is evil. Dahmer knew it was wrong all the time. One of the reasons that he drank as he did the killings, I think, was to silence his conscience, to dull his conscience. This isn't a man that didn't know right from wrong. He knew it was wrong. He knew it was evil.
The hardest thing for the public to accept is that these men view humans as so inferior to themselves that the death of another is trivial compared to the momentary pleasure of the killer. His orgasm is more valuable than your life.
I call him Haley's Comet. He's a total mystery.